Nausea, weakness, fever, and a sharp, growing pain in the lower right abdomen. The diagnosis of appendicitis wasn't difficult. Dr. Leonid Rogozov had seen these symptoms many times in the year or so since he'd become a general practitioner. The inflamed and potentially infected appendix would certainly need to be surgically removed, and this would need to be done before it could burst and cause dire complications. Normally, this would be a routine operation, but this time, the circumstances were anything but ordinary, because not only was it the doctor himself presenting with the concerning symptoms, but he was isolated in a polar winter stuck on the frozen continent of Antarctica. Thousands of miles from anyone who could help, Rogozov had no other options, and he made the torturous decision to venture into unknown territory and operate on himself. While the Cold War is often simplified as a nuclear arms race between the two superpowers, there was a lot more going on than just the looming threat of a radioactive World War III. Each side was constantly trying to outdo and one-up the other, not just in weaponry, but also in exploration, science, and research. This led to historic events such as the space race, with the Soviets becoming the first to put people and stations into space, and the Americans being the first to put a man on the moon. But it also led to some stranger, less productive competitions, such as who could dig a hole deeper into the Earth's crust. One place where this competition was fierce was the continent of Antarctica. Following the end of the Second World War, both countries had a keen interest in establishing a presence near the South Pole, not so much because they really needed it, but more so to keep the other side from taking all of Antarctica for themselves and turning it into a massive military base. During the 1950s, there were a lot of heated debates about the sovereignty of research bases on the continent. The United Nations saw several conferences filled with accusations, territorial claims, and attempted treaties, none of which resulted in any progress until 1959, when 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. This treaty banned all military activity on the continent, designated the entire place as a neutral scientific reserve, and placed it under the care of the UN. No longer would there be a race to militarize the frozen continents, but the scientific research in the area was still of high priority, especially for the Soviet Union, who was investing a great deal of time and money to send some of their brightest minds to the ice. In 1960, the 6th Soviet Antarctic expedition was launched with the goal of establishing the all-new Novolazarevskaya station at Shamacher Oasis, about 50 miles inland from the Antarctic coast. This expedition was made up of a team of 13 researchers and one medical doctor, Leonid Rogozov. After years of study, Rogozov had graduated from the St. Petersburg State Pediatric Medical University in 1959 and immediately found a job as a general practitioner while also beginning clinical training to specialize in general surgery. However, just a single year into his career, he left all of this behind, signing up to be the lone doctor for the crew on the Antarctic trip. After 36 days at sea, the ship arrived on the coast of Antarctica, and after a grueling trek to the designated location, the team got to work building the new station, which was completed in February 1961, just before the polar winter began rolling in. Everything had gone flawlessly so far, but in late April, in the midst of the bleak winter, Dr. Rogozov got out of bed and found himself feeling incredibly weak. Thinking he might be sick, he decided to rest, but the symptoms only worsened as time went on. Soon, accompanying the weakness was a feeling of intense nausea, high fever, chills, and then finally, the symptom he'd been dreading, a sharp, unbearable pain in his lower right side. One quick way to confirm if this pain was related to appendicitis was to jump in place. If the pain doesn't seem to change much, it's probably not your appendix and could be caused by a number of other problems such as severe constipation or food poisoning. However, if a slight jump in place causes the pain to flare up like it's on fire, this is a sign of inflammation in the peritoneum, the membrane between your skin and internal organs, and is probably due to your appendix. Likewise, pressing firmly on the area shouldn't cause too much extra pain if the issue isn't serious, but in cases of appendicitis, applied pressure like this will be excruciatingly painful. The thing about appendicitis is that it's almost never something that can go away on its own. If the root issue is some sort of blockage, yeah, it's technically possible that this can clear up and the problem can be resolved by itself, but this is rare, and even then, it can still lead to an infection. This is why a swollen or painful appendix is always considered an emergency and needs to be handled with surgery and antibiotics as soon as possible. Now, obviously, being a medical professional, Rogozov was aware of this urgency and knew that he didn't have much time to consider his options before he risked the appendix bursting and likely killing him. There was no other option. He would have to operate on himself. The commander in charge of the base contacted Moscow and asked for permission to proceed with the operation. After all, a medical failure and the death of a doctor at a research station would be a catastrophic publicity problem for the Antarctic program. The green light was given, and Rogozov began drawing up a plan to attempt the auto-appendectomy. Writing in his journal the morning of the operation, he said, "I did not sleep at all last night. It hurts like the devil. A snowstorm whipping through my soul, wailing like 100 jackals. An oppressive feeling of foreboding hangs over me. This is it. I have to think through the only possible way out, to operate on myself. It's almost impossible, but I can't just fold my arms and give up." Rogozov selected 2 of the researchers to be his assistants, chosen because he believed they would be the strongest-willed and the least likely to get queasy with what they were about to attempt. As a precaution, the station director would also be in the operating room, ready to replace one of the assistants if they were unable to continue for any reason. He also gave them highly detailed instructions for any contingency plans and wrote them out in case they forgot them. These included how to inject him with adrenaline if he started to pass out, what to do if he completely lost consciousness and couldn't wake up, and how to perform artificial ventilation if necessary. One of the assistants, who was a driver by profession, would be in charge of holding a mirror, moving and positioning it so that Rogozov could see what he was up to, while the other, normally a meteorologist, would be in charge of holding the lamp. On the morning of April the 29th, 1961, everyone entered the operating room, which had been meticulously sanitized and washed in preparation for the surgery. Before he started, Rogozov thought to himself, "My poor assistants." At the last minute, I looked over at them. They stood there in their surgical whites, whiter than white themselves. Rogozov himself was also scared, more nervous than he'd ever been. But as he later recalled, the moment he injected some local anesthetic into the skin, his mentality switched from patient into surgeon, and he completely focused on the task at hand. First, he made a 10-centimeter incision in the abdominal wall. Then he moved on to opening the peritoneum. But while doing so, he accidentally nicked his large intestine, causing a lot of bleeding, but he managed to sew it up calmly. He then moved deeper into his internal organs, the amount of blood becoming so extreme that he could no longer see what was happening by use of the mirror, and made the decision to continue the operation largely by feel, removing his gloves and relying on his sense of touch as he felt his way inside the abdominal cavity with his fingers. By this point, the initial Novocaine had wore off, and Rogozov opted to not inject anymore out of fear that it could cloud his thinking or have unforeseen side effects, meaning that from this point on, he would be feeling everything. 40 minutes into the operation, the pain was so extreme that he was becoming incredibly nauseated and had to take a 30-second rest every few minutes to avoid passing out from pain. He noted how his head was beginning to spin, and with the amount of bleeding he saw, he was worried that he wouldn't survive the operation. Finally, his fingers located the appendix. After clearing some blood from the area and pushing everything to the side so that he could see it for himself with the mirror, he noted, "Finally, here it is, the cursed appendage." With horror, I noticed the dark stain at its base. That means just a day longer, and it would have burst. My heart seized up and noticeably slowed. My hands felt like rubber. Well, I thought, it's going to end badly, and all that was left was removing the appendix. Then, with scalpel in hand, the 27-year-old man, who had only been a practicing doctor for a little over a year, successfully removed his own appendix. After the guilty organ was removed from his body, he administered antibiotics to the region and backed his way up to the surface, sewing everything up as he went. It had taken a little over 2 hours, but the operation was complete. Before giving himself a chance to rest, though, Rogozov ordered his assistants to wash and sanitize the room, ensuring that they did everything properly. Finally, when he was certain that everything had been thoroughly cleaned, he took some antibiotics, some sleeping tablets, and lied down for a well-needed rest. Of course, simply completing the surgery doesn't mean you're completely out of danger yet. There's always a risk of post-operational infection or other complications. However, thanks to his attention to detail and excellently obedient assistance, Rogozov faced no further issues. Following the surgery, his symptoms of nausea and pain gradually improved. 5 days after, his body temperature returned to normal, then 2 days after this, the stitches were removed. Remarkably, Rogozov resumed his normal occupation duties just 2 weeks after the operation. Upon returning to the Soviet Union in 1962, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, as his story had become widely popular once photos of the operation had begun circulating back home. However, Rogozov was never one for publicity, and he largely ignored the fame, instead returning to his clinic to resume his clinical training. He would eventually become the head of surgery at the St. Petersburg Research Institute for Tubercular Pulmonology, where he would stay until he passed away in the year 2000 from complications of lung cancer at the age of 66. Despite his ordeal only lasting a few hours in total, his experience that fateful morning in Antarctica has had a lasting impact on the world. Immediately following the incident, Soviet policy was changed, making health checkups incredibly rigorous before allowing someone to head to Antarctica. And in the years since, many nations, such as Australia, have made an appendectomy mandatory for any explorers moving to Antarctica for long periods of time. Taking the appendix out as a precaution would mean never risking someone needing to operate on themselves again. After all, even after news of Rogozov's success had gotten out, it was still believed that self-surgery was far too risky and such a danger that many doctors at the time were taught to never even consider it. For example, Dr. Duncan G. told BBC, "I was a medical student in the early 60s, and remember being taught what to do if we found ourselves in the Antarctic with appendicitis. We were told to sit upright with our knees pulled up to our chests. Then, if the appendix did burst, in this position, we had the best chance of pus draining into the bottom of the pelvis and becoming walled off in an abscess rather than infecting. We weren't advised to reach for the scalpel." Hopefully, with these precautions, Rogozov's story will remain the only one of its kind, not just from Antarctica, but in other domains as well. There have been several proposals in many nations around the world to make an appendectomy a prerequisite not just for earthly explorers, but also for future astronauts, especially those that may end up living on a base far away, either on the Moon or Mars. After all, if you thought operating in Antarctica was far from help, imagine doing it on another planet. If even a single one of these future appendectomies prevents complications during a mission, much of the credit can be attributed to Rogozov, who brought the issue to the public's attention. His story will forever stand as a timeless example of determination and bravery. Removing an infected organ from his own body was something that he had not prepared for, never studied for, and was terrified of carrying out. But when faced with life or death, he knew he had no other choice.